My name is Rupert. I am the chair of the Climate Majority Project and the author of Why Climate Breakdown Matters. And it is my great pleasure this afternoon to be here to introduce Stephen Markley, author of The Deluge. If you don't know The Deluge, you soon will, partly because you'll hear a little bit about it in this talk, but partly also because you are strongly encouraged to go out and buy a copy afterwards and read it. It is an incredible, necessary read. There is a copy there. We could actually pass it around and people can have a glance at it. You will see that it is not a slim volume. It is substantial. It is a climate epic. It covers a period of approximately 28 years in some considerable detail to tell us a story of what may be coming if things go badly and if things go well. And it is, in my not entirely humble opinion, the best such story we have yet. So you're strongly encouraged to get a copy, or more than one copy. That's what I did. I bought several copies and have been giving them to friends and influential people who are much appreciating it. We enormously appreciate Steve's presence here this afternoon, and as part of this residency that we're having here at Life Itself, where we're looking at strategic adaptation to the climate crisis. What's going to happen now is that Steve's going to talk for maybe 25, 30 minutes.
Yeah.
And he's going to talk a little bit about the deluge, but also more generally about the climate situation we face, with a special view to thinking about the role of fiction and the imagination in facing that. When Steve's finished speaking, there will be a considerable opportunity for us to talk more and engage in wide-ranging discussion to ask questions, whatever it might be. So Steve, without further ado, thank you again for coming, and over to you. Give us a spiel.
Yeah, thank you. Apologies for rushing through this. I just want to get to my beer. That's the... I thought I'd start by just telling you the story of how I came to write the book, and then sort of moving on from there. So I grew up in Ohio, USA, pretty normalish kid who liked basketball and wanted to be an NBA basketball player. That was my dream. Obviously, it didn't work out. I went back to my second dream of becoming a novelist, right? I was pretty, always compelled by fiction. Like, I loved reading. I adored Stephen King as a kid, which makes, like, what has happened later so incredibly special.
You're referring to his endorsement of your book?
Yes, he got a hold of Ohio and gave it like this ringing endorsement on Twitter, and then I sent him The Deluge, and he was one of my, the first fans of the book, which,
and there's a little inside joke here, right, which is that he is actually referenced quite a lot in the book.
Yeah, but like before I knew the guy,
right,
before I traded an email with him. So it was, it was quite something. And so anyway, as I grew older, I was also a very politically charged young man. I would think especially the Iraq War was a big sort of event in my life. When, for the first time I was sort of in college, nearing adulthood, and the idea that your government could just do something so incredibly irresponsible, so pernicious, was really remarkable. Wasn't smiling about the Iraq War, but you slapping your head, sorry. Anyway, so I had always had sort of like a political orientation, and I wanted to be a writer. But the more I sort of, thought about things and became a person who's interested in the world, the more my attention kept returning to climate change, or as it was called at the time, global warming was the way people referred to it. So this was around 2003, 2004. And I remember taking a geology class in college in which sort of the professor was talking about these big epic changes in Earth systems being triggered by like a couple of degrees of warming or cooling, right? How ice ages came and retreated. And then he said something offhand to the effect of like, and given that we're on course to raise the planet's temperature by about 4 or 6, like this should be interesting. And that just sort of stuck with me for a bit. And then the very next year, Hurricane Katrina slammed into the Gulf Coast, right? And I think that was the first moment when I was really like, oh, this isn't academic. Like, this is something I'm going to live through, and everybody I know is going to live through. And that was the point when I started to really see the crisis the way I think a lot of people are starting to see it now, as something that we're going to actually live through and bear witness to. And so, as I graduated from school, from Miami of Ohio, go Redhawks, I kind of wanted to get out of Ohio. And so I spent the next year after that driving around the country. I worked in Wyoming, which with people who read the book will be familiar. That job that Matt has at the beginning, that was the job I had in Wyoming. And that was the summer that I sort of started to think about this book in earnest, around 2007. And I just sort of, I had never written a novel before at that point. I tried to, but very unsuccessfully. But I just had this idea burning in my head about what will the world look like? What will we all live through? What will this feel like to live through? Climate modelers spend a lot of time trying to explain and describe what's going to happen, but it is the job of artists to actually explain to people what that will feel like, right? Or at least that was my idea at the time. Now, when I first thought of this book, of course, I was like, okay, I'll knock this out and this will probably be published by 2010. But of course, I didn't even start it till 2010 and it didn't get published till 2023. And what happened in the interim was just this incredible research project, just this absolute poring over every idea, every sort of take, every trend I could possibly get my hands on in order to try to grapple with, the enormity of this hyperobject, of this change in our planetary systems, this change in our society, this change in our culture. As I was conceiving the book, the first step was kind of to figure out, okay, whose eyes are we going to see this through, right? And at first it was sort of like, maybe this will be like a global novel, like it'll be people from all over the world, from France, from the UK, from Sri Lanka, from Japan. And then slowly I was like, okay, that's biting off way more than you can chew, young man. Like you have to contain this somehow. And so my idea became to view the climate crisis through, an American lens because I was familiar with America, but also because I wanted to demonstrate that the US was really this key actor that was both holding up progress on the crisis, but also had the potential to accelerate it if it ever got off its ass, right? And from that point, you sort of get into the history of the denialism, of the propaganda campaign waged by the fossil fuel lobby, basically going back to the 1950s, but really picking up steam in the 90s. And you look at that history and it's so infuriating and so enraging. And so I wanted to find a way to dramatize that as well. And so sort of from that intellectual rabbit hole I went down was born the character of Jackie, right? So Jackie is this woman who works in advertising and PR for the fossil fuel lobby. And I wanted to just understand a person like that and how they think and what, they hope to accomplish in their lives, right? And so, she was one of the sort of the first characters I knew would be in there. Kate was one of the first characters, obviously, sort of this Joan of Arc character, this woman who has looked at this problem and is like, I'm going to single-handedly fucking beat this thing. And that is sort of the mantra she has in her head as she goes about her life in the book. But also making sure to take a character who is this courageous and who is this heroic, and making sure she also has her flaws and her dimensions that perhaps the reader isn't as taken with, right? So that's how I sort of decided that her story can't be told through her own eyes. Like she has to be seen from all these different vantage points. And what I think that does is it sort of replicates the way we see larger than life figures in the world. They're a little mysterious to us. They're a little bit removed. And when they fuck up, it really disappoints us. And so that was always sort of an angle on Kate that I needed to have. And so her story is mostly told through her partner, this guy who is hopelessly in love with her. And to his great disadvantage, follows her into history, basically, only to sort of have his heart shredded in half at some point. I have to be careful about spoilers, but yeah, you should read the book. It's good. Then, of course, there's like obviously the scientific angle. So there's a character named Tony who's sort of an early warning system for what's happening. And he's surly, and like many scientists, he's not a great communicator. He just sort of wants to do his research until he is sort of forced to comprehend the fact that it's his duty to push as hard as he can on changing this situation. And then there's the character of Ash, who's a mathematician. He is, a neurodiverse person who is incredibly pragmatic about what needs to happen. And to such a degree that at one point in the book, he's like recommending people eat their cats and dogs during a food crisis, right? Like he is like almost looking from the point of view of like, what must we actually do? And people's feelings don't matter about it at all, right? And I think sometimes I joke that like writing the character of Ash changed my mind about more things than I'm willing to admit. And my sister, after she read the book, said to me, she's like, yes, Stephen, it's because you are Ash. Like, this is the person. Everybody thinks you're this person or that person, but it's like, this is your psychotic brain at work. And then there is a character named Shane and a group called 6 Degrees. And they are essentially eco-terrorists who see all of the stuff these people are doing as absolutely fruitless and pointless. And they want to bomb natural gas pipelines and coal plants and to try to change the situation with sort of that kind of radical action. And then finally, the last character is Keeper. And Keeper is not an activist. He is a strung out drug addict in Ohio who has done some terrible things in his life. And this is the character that when you begin the book is the most sort of orthogonal, like you don't quite understand what he's doing there, and that's why he came to be the most important character in the book. And I think like watching his journey, if you read it, it becomes apparent why he belongs, right? But he was like sort of the keystone character, just in the sense of, this is somebody who doesn't have an opinion on this thing. And so he is the absolute everyman. He is the person it's impossible to convince of what's happening, and why he matters is why he matters, right? And so I had written about 40% of the Deluge when Ohio happened, set it aside for like 2 or 3 years. Ohio came out, and the way in publishing, the way it works is like your debut novel's coming out, your agent wants to sell the next book right before that novel comes out. So Ohio is like, I'm like in all the angst and like the pressure of my debut novel coming out, and my agent's like, we gotta sell this next one, right? So we're going to my publisher, Simon & Schuster, my editor at the time, and I sent him the proposal and a couple chapters from the Deluge, and he was like, oh man, this is really different from your Rust Belt novel set in the Midwest about, with this like sort of this murder mystery going on. This is a real big leap out of that. It doesn't really make sense. And so we went back and forth on this for a couple conversations. And he kept saying like, are you sure this is the thing you want to write next? And so like, then like, it just came like bubbling out of me where I was like, yeah, like I care about this book more than Ohio. Like this is the thing I was born to do on this fucking planet, is write this book. So I don't care if you don't buy it, like this is what I'm doing, right? And it wasn't until that moment, keep in mind with like 40% of the book written and like knowing nothing of what I was gonna do with the rest of it, or not knowing nothing, but certainly like having to figure a lot out. That was really like the moment I was like, oh yeah, like your guts are like in this thing. Like it's like your intestines are in this book. And so it sold, and that was wonderful because I'd never written anything with like an actual paycheck at my back before. So that felt great. So 2018 to 2020, I basically wrote 1,000 pages, right, of the novel. Like, so the final draft was 1,500, and in those 2 years, I wrote 1,000 pages and just buried the thing. And sometimes I look back on that time, and I'm like, that's weird that I like did all that in 2 years when the rest of the book took like 6. But I think it was just like it had been bubbling up in me for so long, and then certainly,
and then the dam broke.
Yeah, exactly. And certainly what happened in the interim was, in the book before, which I put aside in like whatever 2015, it had this really scary right-wing figure come to power. And in 2016, I don't know if you guys heard, but this game show host became president in America, and it was a big turning point. Okay, you made. I'll get the internet out later. I'll show you. So I come back to the Deluge in 2018, and I'm like, oh, this isn't scary enough because everything in this first part's already just happened. So I have to like readjust my imagination to encompass a more frightening future than I had initially like kind of planned. But also like the things that were coming true in the book were also sort of green shoots. It was the arrival of Extinction Rebellion and Sunrise Movement, and sort of this burst of activism around 2018 when people were really like, okay, like what is your plan for this? Like this is happening. So I turned in the first draft in 2020 to my editor. I turned it in March of 2020. I bought myself an expensive Lakers Milwaukee Bucks ticket to celebrate, and that was like one of the last NBA basketball games played before COVID shut everything down. And so the next 2 years were spent editing the book in sort of the terror of 2020 and 2021. The way I found out about the January 6th riots at the Capitol was my one friend who'd read the book to give me notes texted me and said, how does it feel to be clairvoyant? And so that, again, these events kept happening where like my editor or people who had read the book were just like texting me, emailing me, being like, this is creepy. And that has been my experience with the novel since publication as well, is the amount of it that just like relentlessly comes to life in mostly bad ways and occasionally good. And I often, let me back up. There's this part of the way I wrote the book where the first part is set in our recent recognizable past, 2013, basically to 2018-ish. And then it elides time and jumps to the future and picks up in 2025. So the entire time I was writing the novel, I was trying to aim this moment with our reality so that when you're reading it, you jump our current moment and you're in the future and you don't really notice it. Like it feels seamless, right? So I thought of it as like making the teeth of the zipper meet. So like that when the book arrives and it's published, it will feel almost as if you're just stepping into like our exact future that we're going into. That was an incredibly difficult challenge because it's all the problems of writing an epic novel. It's the problems of writing War and Peace as Napoleon is about to invade Russia, right? So you're sort of trying to figure out like, what'll happen there. What that produced though is that I'm making like all of these predictions that I'm having to sort of adjust on the fly and tinker with, but that essentially are right like spot, hammer meet nail, right? Like there wasn't that much that seemed too crazy. And the reason is not because I was any kind of clairvoyant. The reason is because I simply, beginning in 2007, maybe even earlier, was just looking at the trends, was literally just looking at what scientists were saying, was looking at what those trends in the science would produce in our politics, in our culture, in our economy, in the way we related to each other. And so it wasn't a hard thought experiment once you're really paying attention. When I sort of grapple with the idea of what we're going to see going forward, like I always say, like the Deluge is not going to predict exactly anything that happens, like not at all. But like the general trends, those are all going to be things we're dealing with. And so it obviously behooves us to be thinking about, all the avenues we have, all the policies we have, all the instruments we have to alleviate that situation before we arrive at it, if that makes any sense. So I feel like I've been talking for an enormous amount of time. I'm certainly ready to answer some questions. I just appreciate all you guys listening to me, and I hope that wasn't too rambling.
Super, thanks, Steve. Is something like VR or something like it. It might be much more AI, for example. Or it could be some kind of melange of the two. But something like that is a kind of reasonable kind of projection forward and a worrying one.
Yeah, absolutely. A vehicle that, our masters in Silicon Valley are already hard at work trying to figure out how to further create profit out of people's psychology.
Yeah. Good. Yeah, makes sense. Right. There is time for questions and discussion, plenty of it. Who would like to throw something in? It can be specifically related to what she's been talking about in the Deluge and so forth, or it can be much more general in relation to climate, imagination, fiction, the future, etc. Who's got something they'd like to ask, Rupert? Go ahead.
I can start. So, one thing reading the book that I also thought of was Octavia Butler's Earthseed.
Yeah.
There's some, I mean, one, your brilliant portrayal of this kind of, doesn't become president, but this kind of deranged character. And in her books, you know, that there's also Make America Great Again. She was truly prophetic.
Yeah.
The question I have is in Earthseed, which also sees this kind of dystopian future, sort of around, it's not really clear there, it's climate or whatever it is, there's this religion that arises. You know, the kind of utopian part is the rising up of Earthseed as this change is the only certainty. In the Deluge, there's reactionary religion, there's people going back to fundamentalist Christianity. Is there things like you would see, while they're not in the book, but like eco-spirituality, what do you think are the kind of religious reactions or the more cultural phenomenon that might arise? You have some of it in the book and you can speak to, but what do you think is happening on that front that would, you know, rather than the reactionary side, that kind of moving us forward into a new civilization side?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll betray myself here as like an ardent philosophical materialist, but you know, I see the novel as like dealing with our material reality, and I get versions of that question a lot. Like, what about the spiritual component? I've done like the silent meditation retreat thing, and you know, I obviously advocate people exploring their inner lives and self. Like, I think that's wonderful. But the Deluge is deeply concerned with how do we move, you know, major parts of our civilization, and I don't know about appealing to people's sense of spiritual whatever connection with the earth. Like, I believe in electrifying everything, right? Like, and so that was the part of the book that I was concerned with, was the nitty gritty of the political, of the economic, of all of those systems that sort of are the water we swim in. And the spiritual component didn't concern me as much, which is why probably it's full of reactionary religion.
I mean, to add obviously, in Butler it's kind of interesting because the Earthseed dream is to go to the stars. I mean, so
so it's to escape Earth and like let it burn.
Well, not let it burn, but the mission is not let it burn, but the purpose part is we need to be up to something bigger than ourselves.
Yeah.
And in this case, it is still sort of a materialist one, which is they're going to build spaceships and actually.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Go off. I mean, but that's the Elon Musk end.
Right, I know, which is why it sounds so terrible now. Like, when Octavia Butler did it, I'm like, great. When Elon Musk is like, yeah, fuck this guy.
Yeah, exactly. But I take your point. So that's the kind of that there's an aspect that what's in there is the reactionary end, and this way is you see that there's a kind of that. I mean, I guess what I'm questioning is. Put it bluntly, would you say at the moment the spiritual end has a bit of a kind of new agey, woo, bad taste to it a little bit, and it doesn't have eco-spirituality makes us think of people dancing around, I don't know, Stonehenge or something. Yeah.
Well, and again, this goes to Rupert's project. It's like I am so concerned with like how do we move mass amounts of people to something, and certainly in the past, like. Inventing Christianity was one way to do that, right? Like, so, and maybe we're all wrong, and Scientology is the thing that will lead us into the better future, and what are we doing here? But from my perspective, it was very much about, like, how do we move these human systems? How do we get enough people on board into a mass movement to adjust the systems that are destroying our natural world and therefore us?
Yeah, I mean, if we make this comparison with Octavia Butler, folks don't know her books. Some of the best stuff like this before Steve came along. Parable of the Sower, Parable of the Talents, absolute works of genius. And for me, the great flaw in them is exactly what you've spoken about. That there's this kind of Elon Musk kind of thing bolted on. That's what's going to give people meaning. That we're going to spread out beyond the Earth. And it seems to me that the nearest thing there is to a counterpart to that in the Deluge, and it does relate to the Climate Majority Project, is, well, what if we thought that our purpose wasn't to spread out beyond the Earth, but to actually save what's going on the Earth? It's not a very deeply surprising thought, but it is actually quite a kind of powerful and purposeful one. potentially.
And I'll add, this is very spoilery, so I apologize, but if you read carefully all the headline sections and sort of like what's going on in the background of the society, you'll notice that in the Deluge there's a Mars mission that everybody's very excited about, and then you'll, like, if you read closely, you understand what happens to that. And that was sort of just my way of thumbing my nose at this idea that we're all gonna go colonize Mars and, like, you know, we'll make a paradise there, but not incinerate it like we did this awesome planet. Like,
yes, exactly.
it's so stupid. Sorry.
Yes, which is the great flaw of Christopher Nolan's Interstellar. It seems to me, people know that film.
Yes.
It's got the same kind of vision of let's just use this planet as a stepping stone to the next one. So, did you have a question?
Yeah, sorry.
I actually do, but...
No, we're ranting here. You go ahead.
Actually, I think we already done this. We burned Venus and now we're here. But anyway, that's
Yeah.
pure speculation. I actually was sort of hearing the words like dystopian in relation to your book, and then I was asking about utopian, and then you mentioned truthopian. Am
Yes.
I lost here? Can you talk a little bit about
Rupert should explain. It's his word, so he should explain.
Yeah, so I coined this phrase of fruitopian because I was dissatisfied with this polarity between dystopia and utopia. And you know, you can see the grounds for the dissatisfaction in the reaction to Steve's book. So critics keep on saying, oh, this is a brilliant dystopia or a brilliant apocalyptic vision. And when I first contacted Steve, I was like, you don't really think it's that, do you? I don't think it's that. And you're like, no, I don't think that's accurate at all. Because the dystopia is like, it's all just shit, right? And that's not what the Deluge is about. The Deluge is about a really hard challenge, which we start to find ways of getting through. So my idea of fruitopianism is, what if we said, okay, look, utopia, it's kind of unattainable, but dystopia is not good enough, however beautifully depicted it is, or whatever. We've got to go through, we've got to find a path through the middle of how we cope with what is coming at us in the best way possible. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the novel's about how do we rise to meet this challenge? And that doesn't mean there isn't darkness in that, because you know, anybody looking at this situation, we're going to be living through some incredibly challenging times. Like, it is baked in at this point, even if we do everything right, which it is going to be difficult to do. And just to say that, you know, in creating this vision of how potentially we can make this pivot point in our civilization towards the possibility of that better future. Like, that was the project that concerned me. So much sort of climate fiction or imagining about the future is always like, it's after all the events. It's in like the Mad Max part, or it's in the Star Trek part, you know, it's in like the everything's honky-dory now part. And I want to do like, what is going to happen in our lifetimes right now? What are the choices we have? What can we do to forestall this? And how can we build that better future we all claim to want? You know?
And there's also clarification, truth. It's not always truth. It's
No,
through.
through, they're going through.
Okay.
Yeah.
I thought, oh, that'd be interesting.
But it's also, I mean, the truth is relevant, right? Because the point is that we've got to engage with reality. Right? That's what Steve's saying. We've got to not fantasize, oh, and everything's going to be fine. We're all just going to live in little communities, and there won't be any more global warming, or we'll go to Mars, and it'll all be fine. Right? This is not truth. This is fantasy. Sorry, go on.
Yeah. Actually, if you're indulgent for a moment, because there's a Dutch journalist, you probably don't know, I'm Dutch, and he wrote an article in the Volkskrant 7 years ago, in 2019, I think, in which was imaginally set in 2069. And so this was in the left-wing Dutch newspaper, the equivalent of The Guardian, and he imagined what had happened over the 50 years. And he was saying, oh, we're still here. And I, all my life, have been so alarmed. I mean, I first heard about the Club of Rome when it came out, and we were going to die in 1980. And I think that kind of thing has been, in a way, dominating my entire life.
Yeah.
And then I read The Guardian, and The Guardian, I think they have an article about the world is going to end within 5 or 10 years, literally every day.
Yeah, right.
And so when I was reading it, and then I wrote to this journalist who was Holland's leading scientific journalist, and said, man, you're crazy, you know, in 10 years' time everything will be finished. And he wrote back and he said, no, we'll still be here. You want to bet? So we have a bet.
Yeah.
So 2019, if we finished, he owes me a whole kilogram of Belgian chocolate.
Well, but will you be around to collect?
Not a good bet, not a
And
good
I'm
bet.
able to collect, and if he's right, I owe him a crate of beer, which I'll make sure will be alcohol-free because I'm against favorite alcohol. But my question is, that really shifted my whole perspective because I've been living my entire life with this threat of we're going to die within 10 years.
Yeah, sure.
And actually, it's not livable. And actually, I thought, well, maybe, then, and I think I'm going to lose a bet. Looks like it, unless some war goes crazy. So since then, it's been a big question for me. Okay, how do I live with this awareness that, well, somehow we also when you read The Guardian, many of these climate change things is like it's always 5 to 12. It's always like playing on fear. It's always on it's the end and this and that. And I saw your book, I think, was The End of Civilization, and I think they're all really, really valid ideas. But I'm going to lose this bet. And I've got 2 kids, and I want them to have a future. That's the other thing that really inspired me. So how do you, when you talked about the issue about how do you mass mobilize people? And I think we made a tremendous mistake doing it out of fear. It's not working.
Yeah.
So what do we do instead? What is it?
Well, I really agree with the idea that like whenever people start yelling about people have been yelling about the end of the world for all of human history, right? Like everybody's always been convinced it's the end of the world. Occasionally it almost has been, right? Like 1962, like yeah, that really almost was the end of the world. But with the Deluge, it was like I didn't want to end the novel that way at all. I do think it's like we're still going to be here. It's just like how horrifying and terrifying is it going to be? What version of a world do we want to have, right? And I do agree to some extent that hammering home fear at like over and over again doesn't really move people. It deadens them.